So up next is Dr. Shari Lawrence Pfleeger from I3P at Dartmouth, the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection, correct?
That's right. That's right. That's why we say I3P. It's a mouthful otherwise.
Easier. Would you like, welcome to get started?
Good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. So the I3P is a consortium of 25 universities, national labs, and nonprofit research centers like MITRE. I noticed MITRE is one of the sponsors. And we do research in cybersecurity and in general information infrastructure protection. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that there are so many of you interested in cybersecurity. And Casey and Costas asked me to talk today about security in medical devices. So whereas what Bill just talked about was mostly the mindset of this, you know, people in front of a computer looking at a screen or looking over somebody's shoulder at a screen, medical devices are very different. And some of what I'm going to talk to you about today comes from work I did with the Institute of Medicine, which put together a panel. You may not know, there's a National Academy of Sciences, part of it is the Institute of Medicine, and the Academy in general, the Institute in particular, puts together committees of experts to look at important questions in the US. The question that I was on a committee to address had to do with the Food and Drug Administration's approach to clearing medical devices, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But I was the only software person on this committee, and everybody else was an ex-regulator, a lawyer, somebody familiar with medical device manufacturing and use. And the idea of software in medical devices was a bit new to the other people on the committee. To give you an idea of how much software is pervading everything, a Boeing 777 has about 70 million lines of code, which sounds like a lot, right? If you're driving a fairly new car now, it has about 100 million lines of code, more lines of code in a car than an airplane, which is a bit scary. And I will show you that the amount of software in medical devices is increasing dramatically in the same way. So I'm going to talk about several things. I'm going to talk about something called the FDA's 510K process, because it's very similar to the way we think about building systems in general. I'm going to talk about the implications for device safety and effectiveness. And the reason I'm focusing on safety and effectiveness, not just security, is because that's the charter in the legislation for the Food and Drug Administration. They are supposed to be the regulator to make sure that the drugs we take, the food we eat, and the medical devices we use are safe and effective. And then I want to talk in general about medical device vulnerabilities. So what's the 510K process? The Food and Drug Administration was created in the 1930s, but there was legislation in 1976 to create this process to speed up what they call clearance of medical devices. Normally, when you think of the Food and Drug Administration, you think about drugs, you think about large-scale clinical trials. That's not always easy or practical to do for medical devices, especially because some medical devices are custom-made. They have a very small number of users, so doing large-scale clinical trials doesn't make sense in some cases. The FDA distinguishes for medical devices between approval, which is a large-scale pre-market evaluation of a device, and clearance, which is what the 510K process, and it has to do with the number in the legislation. The 510K process says if you already have a device that's been approved or cleared, and you make some sort of incremental change, then we'll just make sure that the change hasn't made a big deal difference, and we'll clear it for marketing on the open market. So I'm going to be using some of these terms, and I just want to make sure that we're clear on what they mean. Substantially equivalent means you've got what they call a predicate device, something that's already on the market being used, and you claim that you're making an incremental improvement, and the new one is substantially equivalent to the old one. So it's not intended for devices that can seriously threaten health. There are 3 classes of devices. The most serious ones can kill you. Those usually have to go through the more rigorous process. But the device manufacturers like to use this 510K process because it's faster and cheaper, and it gets the devices to us, the customers, quickly. So if you need this new medical device, it's usually good for us to be able to get the device on the market quickly. So where's the software in all of this? Well, the answer is it's everywhere. If you look at all these devices on the screen, and I'll show you some more in a minute, the software can be in the device, like the thermometer you use to take your temperature. It can be the device itself. An electronic health record is considered a medical device by the FDA. And it can be used to produce devices. So sometimes you're using software-driven machines that have very fine tolerances to create parts, hardware parts that fit together. And sometimes it's a little bit of everything. So you've got a device that has some software and some hardware. Now, that's not different from the other kinds of systems that we develop, but it makes you more aware that the software is everywhere in these medical devices. So I want to talk about several things. I want to talk about the increasing use of software in medical devices. I want to talk about how software is different from hardware, and we as professionals need to think about that a little bit more. I want to talk about the need for a systems approach, and then I want to drill down a little bit, if there's time, into the 510K process itself. How can we learn more about the devices before they go on the market and while they're on the market, and especially from the failures and near failures, so that we do a better job, not just of building security in or of fixing security vulnerabilities, but in anticipating interactions with other things. So there is a profusion of medical devices on the market, and chances are there are some just in this room. If somebody has a hearing aid, it probably has a lot of software in it. Certainly if you have an implanted medical device like a cardiac monitor of some sort, that would have software in it. And the software is pretty sophisticated. My husband has hearing aids, and his hearing aids know when he's on the phone. So the ear that hears the telephone, the hearing aid senses he's on the phone and damps down the other ear so he can hear the phone conversation better. So there are also hearing aids that are Bluetooth enabled, so he doesn't need a special Bluetooth device. He can just talk on his cell phone using his hearing aid. There are all kinds of things, many of which are very good for all of us. You can see from some of these pictures that there are small implantable devices. That's what's in the hand at the bottom of the screen there. And your doctor uses devices all the time. I was just at the dentist yesterday, and he was talking, I'm about to travel, he was talking about being able to send my medical records and x-rays to wherever I'm going. So a lot of these things are really good for us. But what I want to talk to you about is making sure that there are things in the devices that are not really bad for us. So what does the FDA say about the increasing amount of software in these medical devices? And I have a slide at the end, and I'll give Casey copies of all of this. The slide at the end has all of the references, so you don't have to scribble things down. They analyzed, this is old data now, they analyzed device recalls. So these are devices that have failed over time. Device recalls between 1992 and 1998. 7.7% of them had software failures. So that was what, almost 20 years ago. 192, or 79%, so almost all of those software failures were caused by defects that were introduced when changes were made to the software after its initial production and distribution. So you will see in some subsequent slides, I'm going to talk a lot about updates, how we do updates in our business, because according to the medical guidance that the FDA gives, as you'll see, we are supposed to go back and check things for safety and effectiveness whenever we make a change. So Kevin Fu is at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He does a lot of work looking at medical devices, and in particular implanted medical devices. I'm going to show you some of his results. He did an analysis for our Institute of Medicine committee to look at the growth of software in medical devices over time. And he did a presentation, which you can find online at the Institute of Medicine site. 24% of recalled devices that he looked at relied on software. So let's look at some of the numbers more carefully. From 1999 to 2005, 11.3% of recalls were attributed to software. So that's almost a 50% increase from the FDA data that I showed you on the previous slide in an earlier period. And half of the recalled devices relied on software. By 2006, that was a milestone. Over half of medical devices relied on software. And from 2002 to 2010, over 500 recalls of software devices. There were over 500 recalls, and they affected over 1.5 million devices. So that's a lot of devices, especially in people walking around with them. Now, the FDA has subsequently issued some guidance that acknowledges that, and I have a quote. I have more slides than I probably have time to go through, so I'm going to slide over, no pun intended, some of the FDA guidance, and if you want to go back and talk about that during question and answer, I'm happy to do that. But in general, what we don't want is what we call fragility. We don't want these devices to be unreliable or unavailable. We certainly don't want them to be insecure, and we don't want unpredictable behavior. Part of security is availability, and part of availability is making sure we get the same thing with the same inputs, right? We want to have predictable behavior. So let's look at this real example of software fragility. This is a printout from an arrhythmia logbook. This comes from data generated from an implantable device. It's supposed to control your heart for arrhythmias, and it prints out episodes, prints out the date and time, the type of episode, and a bunch of other things. And you read this from the bottom up. So the earliest episodes are at the bottom, the newest ones are at the top. And everything looks fine. The first few episodes, reading from the bottom up, were all on May 21st of 2007. And then all of a sudden, 2 episodes drop back to June of 2005. So clearly something is wrong. This is not the sort of behavior you expect, and it's a software problem. So your doctor may be reading a printout like this to try to get a sense of how well your heart is doing on your implanted medical device, and all of a sudden the data make no sense. This is what we don't want to happen, but this is a real example. And this software can be life-threatening. Here's another example, and it's a user interface example. Medtronic made a device that administered medication. And this is from 2003. Part of what the interface allowed was the technician saying how many hours and minutes had to transpire before the next administration of the medicine. But because of a poor interface, the minutes field was used instead of the hours field. And there were 7 serious injuries and 2 deaths as a result. So this is a whole lot worse than somebody looking over your shoulder, stealing your data, which you could argue could be cleaned up. As you saw, Bill made a compelling case. It can be intrusive, it can be expensive, but it can be cleaned up. In cases with some of these medical devices, there's no going back. So the severity of the lack of security, lack of safety and effectiveness in medical devices can be catastrophic. Now here's a more recent example from 2007. You've seen a lot of these multi-use pumps. For instance, if you go into the hospital, into a nursing home, you see a lot of people getting medication, getting their nutrition from pumps. A patient was receiving insulin, anesthetic, and blood pressure medication through a single pump, and all 3 channels failed because of a buffer overflow. Now, when you look at the top 10 security problems that need to be fixed, For how many years have we had buffer overflow on that list? And we still have buffer overflow problems. And here it is just a few years ago, a buffer overflow problem created what? The death of a patient. The patient was brain dead. The blood pressure dropped and the pump was changed, but not in time to save the patient. So think of that the next time you wave your hands at checking for buffer overflows. Make sure you check for buffer overflows. Now, the FDA guidance, this is from one of their documents, they talk about the need for timely software patches. Now, we all know about Patch Tuesday, and we're used to having our computers interrupted to download some critical patch. We periodically get emails for our cell phones telling us that we have to download some latest version of our cell phone software because of patches. So I went online and I looked at information that would give us some sense of the volume of patches that we need to make. And we know, first of all, that patches are not always successful. These updates are not successful. Here's an example of a typical screen we get where the update starts and all of a sudden we're told, well, it didn't work, start the update process again. Here's an example of volume. I went to the Oracle Sun site to find out, just for database management system, right? That's what Oracle does. How many patches do they administer in a year? And the answer was over 4,500 patches. Well, that's fine maybe for my laptop, but it's not so fine if I have to update my medical device, especially my implanted medical device, that many times a year. It's not so good if your doctor is trying to make decisions and all of a sudden his medical record system is hung because he has to make updates to the medical record system. So we really need to rethink in some ways the way we do patches and the volume of patches. Now, I'd like to move from that to a quick discussion of how software is different from hardware. And some of this is motivated by this notion of predicate device. We have medical devices that were initially made with hardware, and many times for very good reasons, we're replacing the hardware with the software. Software is supposed to be more flexible, more easily fixed, more easily updated. But there are significant differences between hardware and software that we really need to acknowledge as security experts. I think the two most important are developer optimism and the fact that software is discrete, not continuous. So let me spend a minute talking about what that means. First of all, many of us, in fact, most of us, are optimistic more than other engineers about the fact that we found the last defect, or we've done enough testing, or we really understand the requirements. And as a result, we end up having overconfidence in our testing techniques, in our testing coverage, and in our ability to find all the big deal problems in our software before we put it out in the field. And there are lots of studies that I don't have time to describe now that verify that testers especially, even more than requirements analysts, for instance, are overly optimistic when it comes to saying that their software is ready for prime time. The second thing is that software is discrete, not continuous, and that means that the things the hardware engineers can do are things we can't do as software engineers. For example, we have high sensitivity to small errors. So if I'm a hardware manufacturer and I'm making something and it weighs a little too much or it weighs a little too little, it probably doesn't matter. But an off by one error in software can be catastrophic. In the same way, we have limited test interpolation. If I'm building a bridge and I test it for 100 pounds and I test it for 1,000 pounds and the bridge doesn't collapse, I can assume that for any weight between 100 pounds and 1,000 pounds, the bridge won't collapse. But we can't do that kind of interpolation in software. We have to test all the cases, and in many instances, we can't test for all those cases or we don't have the time. So we have to be more strategic about making our test plans, and we have to hope that our strategy is correct and complete. And then the third thing is the absence of safety margins. If you've ever read about John Roebling and his building of the Brooklyn Bridge, you'll learn that he doubled the strength of the cables holding up the bridge just to make sure, even though he did all of his engineering calculations, he did all of that and then he doubled everything. We don't have that equivalent kind of safety margin in software. What we do have is what we often call defense in depth. So you use multiple systems to try to make sure that if one system fails or one technique fails, another technique will catch a problem. But there's a lot of literature in the testing community that also applies to security that shows that we're all trained the same way, and we tend to make the same kinds of mistakes. So even when we do what's called N-version programming, or we use multiple kinds of designs, the way they did on the space shuttle, there were 5 different designs, 5 different systems that vote to see what the space shuttle should do next. In fact, the same kinds of errors are made across all of those systems. So we really need to think carefully about how we deal with the safety margin issue when we move from hardware to software. And in addition, we have an immature field plus rapid change. And this is from a National Academy study called Trust in Cyberspace from a long time ago, which is still true, saying that our systems are large, they're complex. Very few people have analyzed systems like this completely, and so we don't always have a good understanding of how the whole system works and how it interacts with other systems. So, for our committee, one of the bottom line questions was, should hardware be a predicate for software? And the answer is, we really have to pay careful attention to the difference between the hardware and the software that's replacing it, because there's more uncertainty in the software test results. So let me go back to some of this FDA guidance for a minute, then I'm going to show you some examples. The manufacturer is responsible for making sure that all the software and hardware work separately and together. And there are validation requirements and guidance that the FDA gives to the manufacturer, and they reiterate what I showed you before, that the software can be in the device, it can be the device itself, and it can be used to manufacture the devices. So essentially, all the kinds of software you can think of involved with a medical device need to be checked to make sure that the software is secure. And in particular, there was a ruling saying that electronic health records fall into that category. So there's also guidance about changes to existing medical device software. So you've already got something out in the field, there's an update to it. How do we check the security of that update? Well, what the FDA says is it wants objective evidence, and it wants to make sure that the requirements can be consistently fulfilled. So getting back to our idea of fragility, being unreliable, unavailable, insecure, and unpredictable, the FDA wants objective evidence, predictability, and consistency. So it's very clear what the FDA wants. For all of us, it's not so clear how we demonstrate that. So I suggest to you that we need a systems approach, and we saw something similar to this in one of Bill's slides, and I'll show you another slide that's even more like the blue slide that he likes. A lot of the medical devices being built now have a model that looks very similar to this, and this is actually a redrawing of something in one of Kevin Fu's papers. The idea is you have something implanted or something you wear, or like a hearing aid, or something you use, and it communicates sometimes through your mobile phone, sometimes through your wireless router, back somewhere else that eventually gets the data onto your physician's computer. So your physician can monitor your health remotely, it can make changes to your devices, it can call you up or send you a text message and tell you you need to take your medication more often or not so often. So there's a lot of dynamic interaction that medical devices didn't do before. And that means that we're talking about systems and not just about the individual device. So here's an example, and this is a Kevin Fu example. Kevin and his students were looking at iPods and MP3 players to see if there might be some interaction between an iPod and an implanted medical device. Okay, reasonable question. They did a whole bunch of tests, and they found there really wasn't any magnetic interference between the iPod and the medical device. But what they did find was that the headphones interfered. And here are some statistics from his study. In 23% of the patients, they documented interference with the headphones. They observed inappropriate pacing, because this was a pacemaker, inappropriate pacing in 15% of the patients, and the inhibition of the detection of something wrong in the pacemaker in 30% of the patients. That's a lot of patients being affected just by the headphones from your listening to music. And you can imagine on a nice day like today, you might be out in the park with your friend has his or her head on your chest, and you've got an implanted medical device, your friend's listening to music. You have a significant cardiac arrhythmia because your friend's listening to music on an iPod. Not a good situation, and something that might not be on your radar when you're testing, when you're testing these devices. So what Kevin and his students concluded was that the patients should keep the headphones at least 3 centimeters away from the implantable device. Now this is more like where we're headed in the medical community. We've got all sorts of devices. We've got perhaps cloud computing in the middle. Everybody's talking to everybody else. We've got a lot of the privacy issues that Bill talked about. We've got these interaction issues. Now, the phone companies know about this for a long time, not in terms of medical devices, but in terms of what for years they've called feature interaction. You get different groups of people developing different products and services, and many of them interact in ways that are unexpected when you put them all together in a phone. Now you put them together in something like this, which is much more complicated, with many more manufacturers not aware of what other manufacturers are doing, and you mix this big soup together, and there's a lot more likelihood that you're going to get the kind of fragility that I talked about before. Related to that, we've got all sorts of questions like, how do we do updates? How do we protect privacy? How do we implement what the medical community calls break glass access? That's when, for example, something happens in a situation where you can't do the normal procedures. You have to get access, for example, to records that normally the doctor might not have access to, right? You're out on a hike, you're climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, you have an incident, and the doctors need to get access to your records, and they're not the doctors you've given normal access to. How do you do that? How do you let a hospital that speaks one language get access to your records in another language? How do you detect security and privacy breaches? And how do you measure some of this stuff? When we measure reliability in software, the real measures, the most sensible measures, are for things that are already fielded. And in the case of medical devices, we want to test the security and privacy before we put things out in the field. So let's go back to this notion of 510K and predicate devices, not just because I was doing work for the FDA, but because that's how we build systems these days. We never start from scratch. We take pieces of things we've built for other reasons, and we put things together. So how do medical device manufacturers use information about the things they've already built and used in order to make new devices? Well, we have to ask questions like, are the evidentiary records complete and consistent? And some of these things are very hard to measure with small numbers of devices. And there are typically no documented arguments somewhere that we can look at to see how the manufacturers are supporting their claims. Often they use simulation. There was just a recall of something called the Dupuy hip. It was a variation using the 510K process. It was a variation of an existing hip that had been used by a lot of people. This wasn't a software issue, but they justified the new hip based on simulations, not on actual usage. Well, we're not always, especially with software, we're not always very good at putting all of the right assumptions in our simulations. And the testing is not always complete. Testing works to show a flaw's presence, but not the absence of things. And as I said before, we've got test coverage problems, we've got optimism bias, we've got unanticipated consequences, and we have feature interaction. Well, you would think that the FDA and the device manufacturers would have a whole bunch of evidence from their previous versions of medical devices. But in fact, all they're required to capture is recall data. So we can learn from failures, but there's nothing we can learn from near failures. There's no documentation of near failures. There's no record of applied updates, at least not a consistent record. And there's not always contextual information. If you've ever looked at help desk reports, there's usually not a category for security problems. So you see what went wrong, but you don't always know why something went wrong. And it's not always clear that it had its source in some kind of security breach. And this problem is going to worsen as we have more devices interconnected, because without that contextual information, it's very hard to know why the device failed. So let's go back to this 510K process. The clearance for use of a device is based on predicates. There's no assurance that the clearance was correctly given, and there's no way to remove undesirable predicates. So let's look at the numbers. The FDA estimates that 40% of devices that were cleared through the 510K process, so since 1976, are no longer on the market. But we don't know why. We don't know why they're just obsolete, nobody uses them anymore, or the sales were poor, or they failed, and they were taken off the market because they failed. And yet, all those predicates are still binding, so you can take an obsolete device, add something to it. If you get clearance from the FDA, you've got that on the market. So there are no IT systems that collect that kind of information. So I suggest to you that in addition to looking at the devices themselves, it's really important that we start building repositories of information about those devices, how they were used, how they failed, how they almost failed. So this is my last slide. So what do we need to do? We need to understand the role of software in medical devices. The FDA needs to analyze the potential effect of that software on the safety and effectiveness of the devices. And I showed you the difference between fragility and lack of it. There needs to be some sort of evidence-based procedures to ensure device safety and effectiveness. And more generally in security, we don't document a lot of those things, and we don't have what we're starting to call evidence-informed decision-making in security. In fact, I'm going to be leading a workshop at the end of April in London on exactly that, sponsored by the Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK, to start looking at how do we look at security software and start building cases based on our experience with building it, with updating it, and with using it in the field, so that we can start learning lessons from each other. And then my last recommendation is that not just the FDA, but all of us need to think about guidance on software validation. How do we build security in not just to these products, but into the way we look at products, so we have some comfort in knowing that, especially in cases like medical devices where people's lives and quality of life depend on the devices, we need to make sure that we're giving people secure, safe, and effective devices. So with that, I open it up to questions. Okay.
Yes. So I couldn't help draw a parallel between an attack that happened in the past few years with some of the things that you talked about, specifically about the tiny tolerances that some of these devices have, and that was the Iraqi centrifuges that were sabotaged by code a few years ago. And so I guess part of that attack was really knowing those particular systems. It was very targeted, but it had a lot of engineers behind it. And so I was just wondering, as manufacturers are developing more and more of these products, both hardware and software related, are they starting to implant people who kind of have an idea of the types of issues that they'll be facing in information security and some of these types of incidents that have occurred?
Yes, and in fact, Kevin Fu's research group has been addressing exactly that. I didn't have time to talk about it, but this notion of hardware and software working together and the role of the software in controlling the hardware is essential. And as students like Kevin's and students like you learn more about this, the awareness will come along with it. I'll give you a quick example. A lot of these implanted devices rely on battery technology, so that's hardware, but it's controlled by the software in the sense that in order to increase the battery life or preserve the battery life, except when the devices are transmitting information or perhaps stimulating your heart or whatever the devices are doing, they're put into a kind of sleep mode. And so Kevin has demonstrated that instead of having several years worth of battery life, his students have hacked in and changed the software so that it never goes into sleep mode. It's constantly transmitting, and so it reduces the battery life from years to weeks or hours. Well, you don't want somebody operating on you any more than they have to replace the battery, so you can actually harm someone and compromise the device by using the software to change the way the hardware works. So there's lots of work like that going on. It's still relatively new, but as people like you become more aware of this problem, you'll be devising more experiments and putting more fail-safe or fail-soft measures into systems so that they won't fail in those ways. Yes?
I'm curious if the FDA is doing anything to look at wireless frequencies when they test. And I remember, baby monitors being able to pick up the neighbor's cell phone and things like that. But with all the different wireless devices in the medical arena, if there's conflicts, they could somehow determine that before they go to market.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about what the FDA is doing now. To be honest, we focused more on the 510K process, but I can recommend that everybody read To Err is Human, Henry Petrosky's book. It's all about how engineers learn more from failures than from successes. And so things like your baby monitor example are things that make us aware of problems that maybe we didn't know about before, and so we make sure not to do the same. We hope that we make sure not to do the same things later on. I know that the FCC is working to segregate transmission frequencies more so that there's less interference. Yes?
My question is around liability for software developers. All this stuff that's occurring is kind of building this case that says, well, if a nurse can be sued for malpractice, why can't a software developer who's creating a product in this space have that same liability? What are your thoughts? What's the kind of feelings and the trends that are starting to come out from these various different discussions that you've been having?
Yeah, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I know that this is a hot topic for discussion. I don't think there's any resolution. My personal opinion, this is not I3P or anything else, is I think the conversation is still all over the place. I don't see convergence on anything yet. There's always a discussion about innovation and the tension between regulation to protect people and things and the stifling of innovation. One of the things we were asked to look at in this 510K committee was whether regulation related to 510K would stifle innovation. And what we found was that there's no clear definition of what innovation is, and there's certainly no data on whether that is or isn't happening. So I think it's still up in the air in terms of liability and innovation, and I think it's going to be that way for quite a while. Yes?
The problem you describe is very similar to what we have in industrial control systems, where you have to have feedback loop and they have to operate in real time. And the issue with the industrial control system is the protocols in use. They have these Modbus DNP3 protocols. And in medical devices, do you have a different protocols in use, or are there standard protocols that are different from the regular protocols in computer systems?
I think the answer is I don't think so, but I think it's very dependent on, on the manufacturer. I don't think there are universal protocols that everybody uses, in the same way that there are very few universal protocols in security, because it's so dependent on not just the hardware and software, but the context of use.
Shari, Kostas Torgis from the George Washington University. A question about the industry and their ability or desire or openness to share information about errors with the FDA and others. Is the medical industry different from other industries that sometimes is playing cards close to the vest, citing competitiveness and so on, or do you see an openness in sharing catastrophic failures or suspicious events that happen? And how can we improve that?
Well, I haven't looked at that particular question carefully, so I don't have any data to give you, but I suspect that it's really no different from any other competitive business, that there's, again, a tension between the need to share and the need not to share to remain competitive. And so the FDA has to navigate through the middle there somehow and try to preserve the competition. Competition is, in many cases, what keeps the cost of healthcare down, but at the same time, lack of competition and the information sharing could help everybody. So I think it's probably like any other business. Yes?
Does there seem to be any inclination on the FDA's part to take a look at these predicates or to change their method of keeping records and just keeping track of this predicate issue? I mean, that seems like a real problem.
There are similar kinds of approaches in other countries, and I know that they're being examined, and there's, I don't remember the name of it, there's a working group that's trying to come up with a unified, since medical devices are sold all over the world now, there's a working group trying to come up with a unified process to do this incremental kind of development and share information so that a manufacturer doesn't have to have different products for different markets. But I don't know the timetable for that working group, but there is work going on, and it involves the device manufacturers and the regulatory agencies, because I went to a presentation that they gave. Okay, I think I stand between you and the coffee.